The courtroom walls don't hide the truth. The grand courtroom smelled faintly of varnish, old paper, and the subtle trace of someone's cheap cologne. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows high above, illuminating floating dust particles like fragments of fractured justice caught in midair. The gavel rested heavily in Judge Roderick Hayes' hand, the familiar weight pressing into his palm like a reminder of his authority. His bench was elevated above the courtroom floor, the symbolic height separating him from the troubled souls who stood trembling before him day after day. Today was no different, at least it shouldn't have been. A young black girl stood in the defendant's area, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was no more than 7 years old, her skin the rich hue of roasted chestnuts, her dark hair pulled into neat braids that cascaded over her shoulders, adorned with bright yellow beads that caught the light each time she shifted nervously. Her name, according to the file in front of Judge Hayes, was Mia Carter. Beside her stood her first-grade teacher, Ms. Karen Simmons, a thin, angular woman whose mouth was permanently set in a pinched line of disapproval. Her navy blazer was buttoned to her throat, and the severe bun at the back of her head pulled her face taut. "This child," Ms. Simmons began, her voice brittle as old parchment, "has been repeatedly disruptive in class. She speaks out of turn, questions my authority, and encourages other children to challenge my rules." Mia's lower lip quivered slightly, but she did not cry. Her eyes, dark and bright all at once, were locked on the judge, her chin raised just a little higher than it should have been for a girl so small. Judge Hayes barely spared her a glance. He had seen this story play out countless times before. The mouthy child, the frustrated teacher, the exhausted parents, if there were any present at all. He could already hear the echo of his own stern verdict forming in the back of his throat, a lecture about respect, responsibility, and consequences. It would be easy. It always was. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, peering over his glasses at the girl. "Young lady, do you know why you're here?" "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was clear and steady, though her hands fidgeted nervously in front of her. "Miss Simmons says I was disrespectful." "And were you?" Mia hesitated. I wasn't trying to be." Judge Hayes arched an eyebrow. "You weren't trying to be. Explain." The girl glanced sideways at her teacher, then back at the judge. Tommy was trying to read out loud, but he was stuttering and getting all mixed up because of his dyslexia. Miss Simmons kept making him try again in front of everyone, even though he was crying. The judge's brow furrowed. This wasn't what he had expected. "Go on." I raised my hand and told her it wasn't fair. That just because his brain works different doesn't mean he's bad or stupid. Mia's voice grew bolder. "I said my mom always told me that rules are important, but not if they hurt people." Ms. Simmons' face darkened. She interrupted my lesson, defied me in front of the entire class, and encouraged the other children to question me. Judge Hayes didn't miss the slight tremor in the teacher's voice, the fear that perhaps her own control over her class was more fragile than she wanted to admit. He leaned back, fingers steepled in front of him. "Young lady, while it's commendable that you care about your classmates, it is not your place to challenge your teacher's authority." "But," Mia started, her small hands clenching into fists. "No buts," Judge Hayes interrupted sharply. "This is a court of law, not a playground." And then, without hesitation, he delivered his verdict. A formal warning to be placed on her school record, with a recommendation for disciplinary action if her behavior continued. His words were clipped, cold, and final. He had dealt with the matter. As far as he was concerned, the girl would learn her lesson, and the case would disappear like so many others before it. Except it didn't. Because Mia didn't bow her head in silent shame. She didn't tear up. She didn't even tremble. Instead, she lifted her chin a little higher, her braids swaying gently, and said the words that shattered the icy authority Judge Hayes had wrapped himself in for decades. "You can't talk to me like that. My dad is your boss." The silence was absolute. Even the court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype. The bailiff, who had been leaning lazily against the wall, straightened so suddenly that his shoulder cracked. Judge Hayes blinked. "Excuse me." His voice was a shade quieter, but the sharp edge of authority still clung to it. "My dad," Maya repeated, "is Marcus Carter." The air seemed to thin. Everyone in the room, from Miss Simmons to the bailiff, knew that name. Justice Marcus Carter, the newly appointed Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, whose reputation for fairness and integrity had made headlines across the legal community. Mia's father. The blood drained from Judge Hayes' face. He knew Marcus Carter, not well, but well enough to understand that the man's influence could easily reach into Hayes' own future. To humiliate the Chief Justice's daughter in open court, to dismiss her voice the way he had dismissed so many others, was no small mistake. It was potentially career-ending. The girl's posture, her calm defiance, her unwavering belief that the truth deserved to be heard, no matter whose authority it challenged, it was all starting to make sense. Mia Carter wasn't just some troublesome kid. She was the daughter of a man who had spent his life demanding fairness, the child of a household where justice wasn't just a profession, but a principle, a way of life. The weight of that realization settled heavily on Judge Hayes' chest. His gavel felt too heavy in his hand, his bench too high. For the first time in years, the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in around him, the authority he had built his identity on suddenly feeling paper-thin. He cleared his throat, fumbling for words, but Mia beat him to it. "My mom always said," Mia continued softly, "that being fair isn't about being the biggest or the loudest. It's about listening to people, even when you don't want to." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Hayes stared at her, and in that moment, he saw not just a defiant child, but a mirror, a reflection of all the times he had silenced others to maintain control, of all the moments he had chosen efficiency over empathy, of all the faces he had dismissed simply because they didn't fit the mold of who deserved to be heard. The cracks in his carefully maintained facade were growing wider. The court reporter's fingers hovered, uncertain whether to record the silence. The bailiff coughed into his fist, shifting uncomfortably. And Judge Hayes, for the first time in his career, felt something far heavier than his gavel pressing down on him. Doubt. "Court is adjourned," he croaked, slamming the gavel down, his voice unfamiliar to even his own ears. Mia Carter stood tall, her head held high, as she turned to leave. Her yellow beads clicked softly with every step, the sound echoing long after she was gone. Judge Hayes sat frozen, the weight of his own reflection staring back at him from the polished surface of his bench. For the first time in decades, the judge who ruled without hesitation was left with only one thought. What happens when the law must judge itself? Cracks in the robe. The steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock filled the silence in Judge Roderick Hayes' study. It was an old clock, handed down from his father, a relic from a time when respect was earned through cold silence and heavy-handed consequences. It stood tall in the corner of the room, its brass pendulum swinging with unnerving precision, the only sound in a house that had grown accustomed to loneliness. The house itself was a museum of muted success. Dark wood floors that gleamed under spotless polish, walls lined with framed legal degrees and commendations, their glass covers reflecting the dim light of the desk lamp. The bookshelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound legal texts, their spines cracked and worn from decades of thumb-through precedents and landmark cases. Yet tonight, all the law in the world couldn't offer Judge Hayes the certainty he once carried like a second skin. The words rang in his ears still, even hours later. "My dad is your boss." It wasn't just the words themselves, though they held enough weight to rattle any seasoned judge. It was the clarity in Mia Carter's voice, the complete absence of fear. She had stood in his courtroom, in front of her teacher, the bailiff, the court reporter, and anyone else within earshot, and told the truth without hesitation. Not just her truth, but his. He had spent his career cultivating an image of stern authority, a man whose rulings were above reproach. His reputation, though sometimes whispered about in courthouse halls, had been mostly untouchable. Even when he ruled harshly against minorities or the poor, there was always the shield of procedure. He had his reasons, his precedents, his interpretations of the law. Even if they were paper-thin justifications, they had always held. But now, a 7-year-old girl had exposed a crack so wide, Judge Hayes could no longer pretend it wasn't there. He set his glasses down on the desk, rubbing his temples with both hands. His head pounded, not from a lack of sleep, though that was certainly part of it, but from the sheer weight of the truth pressing in from all sides. This wasn't the first time he'd ruled unfairly, not even close. His mind wandered, unbidden, to a different case, a family eviction hearing 12 years ago. The Davidsons, a black family who had lived in the same modest home for 3 generations, had been brought into his courtroom after a series of clerical errors put their mortgage into default. The bank claimed non-payment. The Davidsons produced receipts, handwritten ledgers, and letters from their lender promising a correction. But it was Friday afternoon, and Roderick had wanted to make it to his son's school play. He ruled against the Davidsons in under 15 minutes. That night, he missed the play anyway, stuck handling a different case that had gone into overtime. He remembered it in flashes. His son William's face in the crowd as the curtain fell, eyes scanning the room for a father who never showed. The Davidsons had lost everything that day, and so had William, in a way. Hayes leaned back in his chair, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering how many other rulings he had made without seeing the people behind the papers. How many times had he dismissed someone like Mia Carter simply because it was easier? The shrill ring of his phone cut through the silence. He stared at the screen for a moment, the unfamiliar number sending a cold shiver down his spine, before finally answering. "This is Judge Hayes." Roderick. The voice on the other end was low, even, and unmistakably Marcus Carter. Roderick's back stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the phone. "Chief Justice Carter," he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "I assume you've heard." "I have." There was a pause. Roderick's heart pounded in his ears, but Marcus' voice remained unsettlingly calm. "Mia's in bed now, but she told me everything." Roderick swallowed hard. It wasn't personal, wasn't it? Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining just a sliver of edge. "Roderick, we've known each other for 20 years. I've heard the whispers about your courtroom, but I never wanted to believe them." Roderick opened his mouth, but no words came. "I don't care if Mia's my daughter or a stranger off the street," Marcus continued. "When a child speaks up for someone vulnerable, in this case, a classmate with dyslexia, that's not disruption. That's courage." Roderick's jaw tightened. "It wasn't my intention to." "Intentions don't matter, Roderick," Marcus cut in sharply. "Only actions do." The silence between them stretched for a long, uncomfortable beat. "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said finally, "you and I are going to have a conversation. And this time, you're going to listen." The line went dead. Roderick placed the phone down on his desk with shaking hands. His entire career had been built on authority, on controlling the room, the conversation, the outcome. Listening had never been part of the equation, but it would be now. The past has teeth. That night, sleep was a distant fantasy. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the light from the street lamp outside casting pale bars across his bedroom walls. The shadows felt like prison bars, a reflection of the walls he had built around himself, a fortress of rules, laws, and rigid expectations. His mind wandered again, this time to his son, William. It had been 5 years since they had spoken, not because of any one explosive fight, but because of the slow erosion of their relationship, like a river gradually carving through rock. Missed birthdays, stern lectures about grades, the silent disapproval that William could never quite erase from his father's face. When William chose to become a public defender instead of a corporate lawyer, that had been the final crack. Roderick had all but disowned him, not formally, of course, but with the icy silence that spoke louder than words. Now, William had a daughter of his own, a little girl named Lily, who had never met her grandfather. Roderick turned on his side, staring at the empty pillow beside him. His wife, Sarah, had been gone for almost a decade now. She used to tell him, softly, carefully, that he was too hard on William. That love wasn't something you earned by being perfect, but something you gave even when someone was flawed. She was right, of course. But by the time he understood that, William was already gone. Just like the Davidsons' home. Just like every fragile chance at redemption he had ignored. The mirror cracks further. The next morning, Roderick arrived at the courthouse early, his steps echoing through the empty halls. His reflection in the polished elevator doors startled him, the deep lines etched into his face, the gray that had crept into his hair, the tired sag beneath his eyes. He looked like a man being haunted. And he was. Not by ghosts, but by every child, parent, and family he had silenced in the name of efficiency. As he settled into his chambers, the knock came, sharp, deliberate. Marcus Carter stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a cold wind. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression calm but impenetrable. Without preamble, Marcus spoke. "Roderick, I need you to understand something." Roderick braced himself. "Mita's mother, my wife, died last year." The breath left Roderick's lungs in a silent rush. He hadn't known. "She's all I have left, and when you dismissed her, you didn't just disrespect a student. You disrespected everything I've tried to teach her about courage, kindness, and standing up for what's right." Roderick's throat tightened. "I didn't know." "Now you do," Marcus said quietly. "So what are you going to do about it?" Roderick didn't have an answer. But for the first time in decades, he knew he had to find one. Shadows on the bench. The morning light filtered into Judge Roderick Hayes' office, touching every corner of the room except for the man himself. He sat in the farthest corner, beyond the reach of the sun, hunched at his desk, shoulders drawn tight like a man bracing for a storm. The conversation with Chief Justice Marcus Carter still echoed in his head, louder than any gavel strike. "What are you going to do about it?" It was such a simple question, and yet it was the question Roderick had spent decades avoiding. In his courtroom, answers were straightforward: guilty or not guilty, granted or denied. There was comfort in the binary, the illusion that every case could be neatly packaged and labeled. But there was nothing neat or simple about this. Not when the mirror had been shattered, and all he could see was his own reflection staring back from the shards. The Davidson case, the eviction that had haunted his sleep for years, floated back to him unbidden. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, dressed in their Sunday best, standing before him with their 3 children. The oldest boy had been about William's age back then, awkward and hopeful, clutching a folder of documents he wasn't even old enough to fully understand. Roderick hadn't listened. He remembered it clearly now. His mind had been elsewhere, on his son's school play, on the dinner reservation. His stomach twisted. He reached for his phone before he could talk himself out of it, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before the familiar, clipped voice answered. "This is William." Roderick's mouth went dry. "It's Dad." Silence. Roderick's fingers tightened around the receiver. I know this is unexpected. I'm not calling to argue." "What do you want?" William's voice was flat, but beneath it lay something raw, something unsaid. "I need to talk," Roderick said. "Not as a judge. Not even as your father. Just as—" his voice faltered, "as a man who's running out of time to make things right." The silence stretched so long, Roderick thought his son had hung up. Then, "You've got 5 minutes." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Confronting the ghosts. They met at a small diner halfway between their homes, neutral ground, the kind of place where no one would recognize a former judge or a public defender with a grudge. The smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic clang of cutlery. William was already there when Roderick arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, arms crossed over his chest. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same sharp brow line, the same tightness in the jaw when thinking too hard about something. Roderick slid into the seat across from him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "How's Lily?" Roderick finally asked. "She's good," William replied curtly. "Getting big." "I'd like to meet her," Roderick said softly. William's brow twitched, but he didn't answer. Roderick didn't press. "I made mistakes," he continued, "more than I can count. With you, with your mother, with the people who stood in my courtroom." William snorted softly. "That's an understatement." Roderick swallowed the sting. "I can't change the past, but I can't pretend it didn't happen either." William's gaze was sharp. "Why now? After all these years?" Roderick's throat tightened, "Because a little girl stood in my courtroom and reminded me what courage looks like." William's expression softened, just slightly. "Mia Carter." Roderick nodded. "She's special," William said quietly. "Marcus and I crossed paths once when we were both working pro bono cases. Sandra, his wife, was one of the kindest people I ever met. When she died, it crushed both of them." Roderick's fingers traced the edge of the napkin. "I spent my life thinking strength meant control. But Mia, she showed me it means something else." William leaned back, studying his father. "And what are you going to do with that realization?" Roderick exhaled slowly. "I'm going to start by listening. To her. To the families I've wronged." He paused, meeting his son's eyes. "And to you." The air between them shifted, still strained, but no longer impenetrable. "We'll see," William said, his voice softer than before. "Talk's cheap." Roderick nodded. "I know." The visitor. That evening, as Roderick locked up his office, a soft knock echoed from the door. He opened it to find Mia Carter standing there, clutching a drawing in both hands. "Hi, Judge Hayes." Roderick's heart twisted. "Hello, Mia." She held out the paper, a crayon drawing of a courtroom. But instead of the usual stern judge, this one was smiling, standing beside a group of children who were all holding hands. "I made this," she said shyly. "It's for you." Roderick knelt down, accepting the drawing with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mia. My mommy used to say," she continued, "that people can change if they want to." Roderick's eyes stung. "I'm trying." Mia beamed. "That's good enough for me." It was a child's forgiveness, unearned, unconditional, and it hit him harder than any gavel. As she skipped down the hallway, her braids bouncing and beads clacking like soft music, Roderick stood there, holding the drawing like a lifeline. For the first time in years, the weight of his robe felt lighter. The first step. The next morning, Judge Roderick Hayes stood before an empty courtroom. His hands rested on the bench, no longer gripping it like a shield. The room was silent. No plaintiffs, no defendants, no court reporters. Just him. And the promise of something better. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Davidsons, his voice shaking only slightly. "This is Judge Hayes," he said when someone answered. "I'd like to talk, if you'll let me." The line was quiet, but not dead. A beginning. A judge on trial. The early morning light had a way of making even the courthouse seem hopeful. The wide marble halls, usually cold and indifferent, gleamed with a softer glow as sunlight spilled through the narrow windows, cutting across the polished floors in golden streaks. But hope had no place in Judge Roderick Hayes' office. The folder in front of him lay closed, yet its weight seemed to press through the wood of his desk, into his chest, and deeper still, to the place where guilt resided. It was the Davidson file, the very case that had haunted his conscience for over a decade, the file he hadn't looked at since the day he signed his ruling. The one that took a home, shattered a family, and became a ghost that walked beside him ever since. His fingers hovered over the file before he forced himself to open it. There were the records, dry legal language boiled down to cold facts. Payment disputes, foreclosure notices, motions filed, evidence overlooked. There, in the corner of a transcript, was the line that struck him like a slap. "Your Honor, if I could just explain." He remembered that moment, the way Mr. Davidson had stood there, his tie too tight around his throat, his voice breaking as he tried to speak. Roderick hadn't let him. Time had been short. He'd been so sure that procedure mattered more than perspective. Roderick clenched his fist at the memory. His son William was right. That wasn't law. That was laziness, a choice to value efficiency over empathy. He had thought himself unshakable, but in truth, he had been running scared. From difficult questions, from uncomfortable realities, from the possibility that a man in a robe could still be wrong. A quiet knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he called, voice hoarse. The door opened, and Marcus Carter stepped inside, moving with the calm authority only a man who knew the weight of justice could carry. In his hands was a slim manila folder, much thinner than the one on Roderick's desk, but equally heavy in meaning. "Roderick," Marcus said, his voice even, "I thought you might want to see this." He placed the folder on the desk, his fingertips lingering on the edges before he stepped back. Roderick hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of letters, handwritten and printed, some from families whose cases had crossed his bench over the years, others from former clerks and public defenders. Some were thank yous, but many were not. Some were pleas for reconsideration, for mercy it had never come. But one stood out. It was from Sandra Carter, Marcus' late wife. Roderick's breath caught as he read her handwriting, elegant and clear. "Dear Judge Hayes, you probably don't remember me. We met only briefly at a charity event years ago. I didn't introduce myself as Marcus' wife. I wanted to hear how you spoke when you weren't performing for a colleague. I listened as you told a young law student that the most important trait a judge could have was detachment. You said a good judge doesn't get too close to cases, that they keep the law as a shield between themselves and the people they rule on. That made me sad, because law isn't a shield. It's a bridge between people, between communities, between pain and understanding. If you build that bridge high enough, maybe you can even see yourself on the other side. I hope one day you find the courage to cross it. With hope, Sandra Carter." Roderick closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He couldn't remember the conversation Sandra referred to, but the words detachment and shield rang true. They were the foundation he had built his entire career upon. Distance meant control. Distance meant protection, not just for himself, but for the illusion of fairness. Except fairness had never lived in the distance. It had lived in the faces he had ignored. "I failed her," Roderick said quietly. "I failed them all." Marcus didn't speak right away. He let the silence hang, trusting that Roderick needed to sit with the weight of his own confession. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Roderick had ever heard it. "You have a chance to change that." Roderick shook his head. "How?" "A few words. An apology. That doesn't bring back homes, or years lost, or the trust I burned down to the foundation." "No," Marcus agreed, "but doing nothing ensures none of it ever matters." The two men stood in silence, a silence not of accusation, but of possibility. And then Marcus turned and left, leaving Roderick alone with his ghosts. The Thompsons' front door. The house was smaller than Roderick expected. It sat at the end of a narrow street, its paint faded but clean, the porch sagging slightly but well swept. There were flower pots filled with struggling daisies, and a child's chalk drawings covered the cracked sidewalk. It was the kind of home people fought to keep. He rang the doorbell before he could lose his nerve. The woman who answered was Mrs. Thompson, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharper than her years. It took her only a second to recognize him, and when she did, her hand tightened around the doorframe. "Judge Hayes." Her voice was cool, not angry, but guarded. Roderick removed his hat, holding it in front of him like a penitent man entering a church. "Mrs. Thompson, I was hoping you might allow me a few minutes of your time." She stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, against what seemed to be her better judgment, she stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of baking bread and lemon cleaner. A home tended with care. Photos lined the walls. Her children, grandchildren, and a man in a wheelchair, his smile soft despite the lines of hardship carved into his face. Mr. Thompson, the man whose business folded after Roderick's ruling sent his finances into a spiral. The man who had once stood before Roderick, trying to explain his story, only to be cut off. "What do you want, Judge?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her arms crossed over her chest. Roderick's throat felt dry, the words heavy in his mouth. "To apologize," he said finally, "and to listen." She stared at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Now you want to listen." "I should have listened then," Roderick admitted. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to hear your story now. Not as a judge, as a man who's finally learning how to understand what justice really means." Mrs. Thompson didn't move at first, but then, slowly, she sat. Her hands rested on the table, her fingers interlaced, knuckles slightly swollen with age and work. "My husband's in the back room," she said softly. "He doesn't talk much anymore." Roderick sat too, his back straight but not stiff, his hands resting flat on his knees. "I'll listen to whatever you're willing to share." For the next hour she did. She told him about the business they built from nothing. A small auto repair shop that had served their neighborhood for 2 generations. About the clerical error that started it all. The missing paperwork that led to foreclosure papers on their doorstep. About the bank's refusal to reconsider. And the day they stood before Judge Hayes hoping, praying for mercy. Roderick hadn't seen any of it. He hadn't wanted to. By the time she finished, his throat burned with unshed tears. "I can't give you back what you lost," he said softly. "But I can promise you, no family who stands before me again will be treated the way I treated yours." Mrs. Thompson's expression didn't soften, but there was something in her eyes, the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. "Words are easy, Judge," she said. "Show me." Roderick stood, placing a business card on the table. "If you ever need help, legal advice, connections, my door is open." She didn't pick it up, but she didn't throw it away either. As he stepped back out onto the porch, the morning light seemed just a little warmer. The weight of their stories. The low hum of fluorescent lights filled the conference room on the 3rd floor of the courthouse. It was a room Roderick Hayes had rarely entered in his long career. Judges didn't gather here. It was used for community outreach programs, mostly unattended by the very people who needed them most. Today, the room was full. The folding chairs were set in uneven rows, filled with parents, teachers, advocates, and the quiet, restless presence of children. Children who were used to being ignored until they caused trouble. Some sat with arms folded. Others fidgeted with their sleeves, pencils, or the edges of their notebooks. Roderick stood near the doorway, unsure if he was welcome. He wasn't there as a judge today, not officially. Marcus Carter had called the meeting, inviting parents and guardians to discuss the pilot program, a mentorship initiative designed to give vulnerable children access to guidance and resources before they ended up in courtrooms like his. Roderick knew the whispers had already started. Why's he here? He had heard them on the walk-in. He couldn't blame them. If they knew about the Davidsons, if they knew how many families had been caught in the gears of his efficiency-first rulings, they'd probably demand his resignation on the spot. He had come anyway. The first speaker was a mother whose son had been suspended 3 times for disruptive behavior. She spoke haltingly, her fingers worrying the hem of her cardigan, as she explained how no one had ever asked why her son acted out, only how fast they could remove him from class. The second was a grandfather, raising 2 boys on his own after his daughter's overdose. His voice cracked as he admitted that some days he didn't know if he was failing them both. Each story added weight to Roderick's chest, like bricks laid one by one. But it was the third speaker who undid him. A woman, tall, with a crown of silver-threaded braids, and the unmistakable posture of someone who had carried her own burdens for far too long, stood slowly. Her voice was clear, but low, as though speaking too loudly would make the pain too real. "My name is Linda Davidson." The breath left Roderick's lungs. He had expected this moment, had even prepared for it in his mind. But reality was sharper than memory. She wasn't the frightened woman clutching papers in his courtroom anymore. She was older now, her face lined with the passage of years, her eyes too tired for the fight she still carried. 12 years. 12 years since he'd ruled against her family without reviewing half the evidence they'd brought. 12 years since her husband's health collapsed under the weight of their displacement. 12 years since her son left college to help support them, a future traded for survival. "We tried to do everything right," she said. "We showed up. We followed the rules. We believed the system would see us. But we weren't seen. We were handled." Roderick's fingers dug into his palm, his nails leaving crescents in his skin. "No one asked why the paperwork was missing, or why our lender's records didn't match ours. No one gave us a chance to speak. Not really." She drew a slow breath. "The judge that day didn't even look me in the eye when he ruled." Roderick's vision blurred, shame swelling in his throat until it nearly choked him. But Linda Davidson wasn't done. "My husband passed 3 years ago. Stress," they said. Heart gave out. Her chin lifted slightly. "My son, the one who left school to help us. He works 2 jobs now, no degree, no pension to build toward. He still blames himself." Roderick's knees felt weak. "And me." Her smile was small, tired. "I stopped waiting for apologies a long time ago." The silence after her words was absolute. Roderick didn't realize he was standing until Marcus Carter gently touched his shoulder. His feet had carried him toward the center of the room without permission from his mind. Everyone was watching him. He could walk away. It would be easier. It would be what he'd always done. Instead, his voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Davidson," he said, his throat dry. "I was that judge." The room held its breath. Linda's head turned slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as though she was piecing together a memory. Recognition flared in her expression, and Roderick braced for her rage, the rightful storm of anger that he would have no defense against. But she said nothing. Roderick's voice shook. "There's no excuse for what I did. No justification I could offer that would make it right." She said nothing. "I was wrong," he continued, "not just about your case, but about the way I saw my role. I thought justice was about speed, about keeping the system moving. But justice isn't about time. It's about people." Her silence was heavier than words. "I can't give you back what you lost," Roderick said. "But I am here to listen now, to hear all of it, not as a judge, not as someone above you, but as someone who failed you." Linda stared at him for a long, painful beat. Then she turned and walked out. Roderick stood in the center of the room, the weight of her absence pressing against his chest, while the gathered family shifted uneasily in their seats. A visit uninvited. That evening, Roderick sat in his study, the silence of his home no longer comforting. The weight of what he had done, not just to Linda Davidson, but to so many families, felt heavier than ever. The doorbell rang. He almost didn't answer. But when he opened the door, Linda Davidson stood there. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. "You said you'd listen," she said. Roderick stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his son had once sat doing homework, while his father worked late into the night, too busy for Little League games or bedtime stories. And Linda talked. She told him about the house they'd lost, the community they were driven from, the friends who drifted away when their fortune turned. She talked about starting over at 50, renting from landlords who saw them as risks, not people, about her husband's slow decline, his guilt eating him alive even as his heart failed. Roderick didn't speak. He just listened. Somewhere around midnight, Linda's voice finally softened. "I didn't come here for apologies," she said quietly. "I came because you said you'd listen. That's more than anyone's done in 12 years. Roderick's throat burned. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Linda stood, her coat draped over her arm. "We can't undo the past, Judge Hayes." "I know. But maybe," she said, "you can help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Roderick rose to his feet, nodding once, his hand trembling as he held the door open for her. "I intend to." The first case after. The next morning, Roderick Hayes walked into his courtroom, the familiar robe hanging heavy on his shoulders. The first case on the docket was a landlord-tenant dispute, a family facing eviction after losing income during a medical crisis. Roderick sat, his gavel resting lightly against the desk. Before either attorney could speak, he did something he'd never done before. "I'd like to hear directly from the tenant," he said, his voice calm. "Please tell me your story." The attorneys blinked, surprised. The tenant, a woman in her 40s, her hands trembling as she stood, opened her mouth, hesitant at first, but then her words spilled out. Roderick listened to every word, and for the first time in his career, he truly understood what it meant to preside over a courtroom where justice wasn't just handed down, but heard. When the ruling came, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't efficient. It was fair. The court reporter would later note the slight tremor in his voice when he delivered it. The first crack of a man learning how to break free of the walls he'd built around himself. The weight of the robe. The courthouse halls had never felt so narrow. Roderick Hayes walked their length, his shoes echoing off polished marble, but the sound no longer carried the authority it once had. It was no longer the confident, even stride of a man convinced of his own righteousness. It was the measured, deliberate pace of a man carrying the weight of self-awareness, heavy, humbling, and inescapable. Word had traveled fast. The story of Judge Hayes' confrontation with Linda Davidson, of his sudden insistence on hearing families out before issuing rulings, had made its way through clerk gossip chains and passed between defense attorneys like folklore. No one was quite sure why the change had come, but they knew. The old Hayes was dying. In his place, something less certain, but perhaps more human, was trying to emerge. This morning was different, though. This morning wasn't about renters or small claims cases or first offenders. It was about Mia Carter, the little girl who, with a single sentence, had triggered the undoing of a career built on distance. The hearing room. Roderick sat in a smaller, second-floor hearing room, far from his usual courtroom, waiting. His hands were folded in front of him on the polished table, a defendant's posture, not a judge's. The walls were bare, lacking the dignity or weight of a courtroom, making the space feel like an afterthought, a place where things were handled, not heard. The door opened, and Marcus Carter stepped inside, followed closely by Mia. She was wearing her school uniform, a bright yellow headband that matched the beads in her braids, and she carried a pink folder almost as big as her chest. She sat across from him, legs swinging under the chair, her feet nowhere near the floor, but her back was straight, and her eyes were just as bold and unflinching as they had been in his courtroom. "Hi, Judge Hayes," she said. Roderick smiled, but it was small and careful, like someone holding a fragile piece of glass. "Hi, Mia." Marcus sat beside her, but it was clear he was only there as a witness. This was Mia's show, and they both knew it. Mia opened her folder and carefully removed a drawing, not one of her usual crayon portraits of stick figures holding hands. This one was a scale, like the symbol of justice, except one side held a group of children, and the other held a single judge's gavel. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, holding it up. Roderick leaned forward, studying the picture. "It's a balance." Mia nodded. "Daddy says judges are supposed to balance the law and people's stories, not just rules, but the stories too." Roderick's throat tightened. "Your dad is right. You didn't listen to my story," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Roderick didn't flinch. "No, I didn't. And I was wrong." Mia looked down at her picture, tracing one of the little stick kids with her finger. "Mommy said I should always tell the truth, even when it's scary." "That's very good advice," Roderick said softly. "So I need to tell you something." Roderick sat up straighter. Okay. Mia's lip wobbled just slightly, but she held her ground. When you were mean to me in the courtroom, I wasn't scared for me. I was scared for Tommy. Because if grown-ups like you don't listen, then who's going to help kids like him? Roderick's chest ached at the simplicity of her fear. The kind of fear that came not from selfishness, but from compassion too big for her small body. You're right, he said, his voice thick. And that's why I want to listen now. Not just to you, but to kids like Tommy, and to parents like your dad, and to everyone I've ignored for too long. Mia considered him carefully, her small face scrunched in the exaggerated seriousness only children can master. Are you really gonna do that? Or are you just saying it because Daddy's here? Roderick's laugh surprised even himself. Short, hoarse, but real. Mia, I'm doing it because you reminded me that being a judge isn't about being right all the time. It's about being fair, even when it's hard. She leaned back, folding her arms. Good, 'cause if you mess up again, I'll tell Daddy. Marcus, silent until now, chuckled softly. You won't have to, sweetheart. I'll already know. The letters. That afternoon, back in his chambers, Roderick sorted through a stack of letters. They came from everywhere. Parents, defendants, former clerks, even a few fellow judges. Some were thank yous from families he had shown mercy to in recent weeks. Others were condemnations from those who would never forgive the choices of his past. A few were requests to review old cases, to revisit rulings made in haste. The most surprising letter was from William. It was short. Dad, I saw what you said at the community meeting. Lily wants to meet you. Don't screw it up. William. Roderick's hand shook slightly as he placed the letter down, blinking rapidly against the sudden burn behind his eyes. It was the smallest of olive branches, but it was something. And something was all he needed. The first meeting. 2 days later, Roderick stood awkwardly in the park, hands stuffed into the pockets of his slacks, waiting at the edge of the playground. Lily came running first, a bright spark of motion, all pink sneakers and bouncing curls. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head in the same curious way William used to do when he was 4. Hi, she said. Hi, Roderick replied, his voice gentler than it had been in decades. Mom says you're my grandpa. I am, Roderick said, swallowing the lump in his throat. If you want me to be. Lily considered this for a moment, then shrugged. Okay. She handed him a small, slightly melted popsicle, a peace offering, bright orange and sticky. Roderick took it, marveling at how something so small could feel like absolution. The council room. The mentorship program was officially approved for expansion the following week. 3 new courthouses would launch pilot programs modeled after the one Roderick had helped create, with a special focus on giving children like Mia and Tommy a place to be heard before they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. Roderick sat at the back of the room during the vote, not as a judge, but as a witness to what compassion could build when people were willing to lay down their pride. Eleanor Marsh, his once stern colleague, approached him after the vote. You're not who I thought you were, she said. Neither am I, Roderick admitted. She held out her hand. Welcome back to the human race, Judge Hayes. The final case. The last case Roderick heard before stepping down from his regular bench was another eviction case. This time, he asked for the tenant's story first. The lawyer protested, citing rules and procedures. But Roderick held firm. The tenant, a single mother working 3 jobs to keep her daughter in school, spoke haltingly at first. Then the dam broke, and her story spilled into the room. Roderick listened. He ruled with fairness, not indulgence, not pity, but fairness. When the case was over, the mother approached him, shaking his hand with tears in her eyes. Thank you for listening, she said. Roderick smiled. Thank you for trusting me too. The weight reclaimed. That night, Roderick Hayes stood in his study, holding his old gavel in his hand. It felt lighter than it had in years. Not because his authority was gone, but because, at long last, he understood that authority was never supposed to be a weight. It was supposed to be a bridge. One built on listening. One built on understanding. One built, at least in part, by a little girl with braids and bright yellow beads, who was never afraid to say, "My dad is your boss."